Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 2, Sankhya Yoga, Part 7. Now, Sri Krishna Paramatma dwells upon the spiritual nature of the soul. Ascharyavat pashyati kaschidenam, Ascharyavad vadati tathaiva chanyaha, Ascharyavat chaina manyashrunoti, Shrutvaapyenam veda na chaiva kaschit. One perceives the soul as marvelous, another speaks of it as marvelous, another hears of it as marvelous, while none knows of it, only by hearing of it. The knowledge of the self is not a subject of senses. The self can be known by the self itself. It is beyond the access of senses. As I am, this knowledge requires no proof, no instrument, it is self-evident. This consciousness can't be experienced as separate from I. This is intuited by the person himself. This is not a subject of senses and intellect. Therefore, the knowledge of the self is said to be marvelous. The term pashyati has two meanings: to see with eyes and to know the self by one's own self. So, here it has been used in the sense of knowing the self by one's own self. When one sees with one's own eyes, there are three things necessary: the onlooker, the object to be seen, and the sight. That is, the power to see. But while knowing the self, these three things are not necessary. I am. This cannot be perceived by senses, mind, and intellect, but by one's own self. When we want to search for a thing in a dark room, we need eyesight as well as light. But if there is a lamp light, there is no need for another lamp to see the lamp which is lit. Similarly, there is no need for other means to perceive the self. The self has its own light by which it can be known. The body is of three kinds: physical, subtle, and causal. The body which is nourished by food and water for its growth is physical body. This gross body is the object of senses. The subtle body consists of 17 elements, 5 senses, 5 organs of action, 5 vital hairs, mind, and intellect. This subtle body can be perceived by intellect and not by senses. The latencies, that is ignorance, is a causal body. If we reflect on the three kinds of bodies, it is evident that the gross body is not the self, as it changes every moment, and it is an object of knowledge. Similarly is the case with the subtle body. The causal body is an evolute of nature, but the self is beyond nature. Therefore, the causal body is also not the self, but as far as the knowledge of the self is concerned, it is beyond them, and this knowledge is marvelous. This is Ascharyavat pashyati. When the soul ceases its identification with the body, it knows itself, and therefore it has been said that one perceives the soul as marvelous. Here in this verse, as well as in the third verse of the 7th chapter, Sri Krishna Paramatma has used the term kaschit, that is, someone knows me in reality. It means that it is very difficult to know the imperishable, but actually it is not so. The fact is that it seems difficult because there are a few aspirants who want to know the soul with a sincere heart. Another person speaks of it as marvelous because it is beyond the reach of speech. The speech is illumined by the self. Then how can it describe the illuminator? The great souls who speak of it can just give a kind of hint to draw the attention of the listeners. Here the term Anya has been used to emphasize the fact that only the few liberated souls who possess metaphysical knowledge can explain it fully to the aspirant and enable him to attain the imperishable. All don't possess the ability to remove his doubts and give satisfactory answers to his own arguments. Another hears of it as marvelous. Hearing of the scriptures and of other words is quite different from hearing of the soul. It means that this soul is something marvelous and uncommon and is beyond the reach of senses, mind, and intellect. It rather illuminates them. Here, the term Anya has been used to explain the fact that the person who hears is different from the one who knows and is also capable of explaining it to the aspirant in such a manner that its full nature is revealed to him. There are some who don't know it even on hearing. It means that merely hearing will not help one to know it. On hearing, when one gets established in one's own self, one will know one's own self. Now a question arises that an aspirant on hearing the words of the scriptures and the preceptor gets knowledge. Why has it been said that there are some who don't know it even on hearing of it? The answer is that it is the aspirant himself who, by having faith in the words of the scriptures and the preceptor, gains knowledge. Otherwise, there have been several incarnations of God, and there have also been liberated souls who held discourses on metaphysics. So, by hearing their discourses, all the people should have gained metaphysical knowledge. But actually, it has not happened. Their discourses can be helpful to a striver having faith, but he will also have to get himself established in his own self. This expression doesn't mean to convey that knowledge of the self is impossible. It rather conveys that it is beyond senses. However hard efforts a man may make to know it, ultimately he will have to know himself by his own self. What is knowing of the self by the self? There is a difference between doing, perceiving, and knowing. Doing involves organs of action. Perceiving involves senses, while knowing is done by the self itself. The senses actually don't know, rather, they only perceive, which is useful in daily transaction. This knowledge of knowing oneself by one's own self is of two kinds. That is, I am different from the body and the world. And secondly, I have identity with God. In other words, it can be said, I have no affinity with the kaleidoscopic perishable world, while I have constant affinity with unchangeable, imperishable God. After possessing this kind of knowledge, one can know the soul in reality. This knowledge is beyond the reach of speech and intellect. The next verse is a concluding verse about the discrimination between the body and the soul. Dehi nityam avadhyoyam dehe sarvasya bharata tasmat sarvani bhutani natvam shochitum arhasi. O Bharata, this soul residing in the bodies of all can never be slain. Therefore, you should not grieve for any being. The soul residing in bodies of men, gods, animals, birds, insects, and so on cannot be slain. It is imperishable. The term avadhya has two meanings. It should not be slain and it cannot be slain. For example, a cow should not be slain because it is a deadly sin to slay a cow. But in case of the soul, it does not mean that it should not be slain, but it means that the soul cannot be slain in any way by anyone. It has also been mentioned that none can bring about the destruction of this indestructible substance. Therefore, you should not grieve for any being because the soul is indestructible while the perishable body cannot remain the same even for a moment. Here in Sarvani Bhutani, plural number has been used to emphasize the fact that one should not grieve for any living being. The body is perishable because its nature is so. It is perishing every moment, but the self is imperishable. If this reality is realized, then no grief is possible. Something noteworthy. In this section, from the 11th to the 13th verses, there is a description that the soul which is imperishable and real is different from the body which is perishable and unreal. Unless one can discriminate between the soul and the body, one cannot follow any one of the disciplines either of disinterested action or knowledge or devotion. Not only this, but also one who wants to go to heaven should know the distinction between the two. Otherwise, after the death of the body, who will go to heaven? Therefore, all the philosophers who are believers, in spite of having different opinions about philosophy, agree to the fact that the soul is different from the body. Here, Sri Krishna Paramatma wants to explain this distinction. This is everyone's own experience also, that the body changes from babyhood to youth and then to old age. But there is an unchangeable one who knows this change. That one is the soul. Therefore, the changeable and the unchangeable can never be identified. In this section, Sri Krishna Paramatma has not used the philosophical terminology because people think that philosophy is a subject to study only. So, he has used such words as the real and the unreal, the perishable and the imperishable. One who can discriminate between the two is not grieved in the least, while one who merely studies philosophy is grieved. The man may study the 6 systems of philosophy and may possess knowledge that there are the absolute, the soul, the nature, and the world. But his knowledge is purely theoretical. On the other hand, there is a practical striver or a devotee who wants to realize his identity with God, or who wants to surrender himself to God by renouncing his assumed affinity for Prakriti and the world. Arjuna was grieved by foreseeing the death of his kinsmen and preceptors. Moreover, he was afraid that sin would accrue to him by killing them, and that sin would lead him to the hell. Therefore, Sri Krishna Paramatma preached this gospel from the 11th verse to the 13th verse. So, he starts the worldly standpoint and reminds Arjuna of this duty as a member of the warrior class.